Once upon a time there lived in a far-off Indian country a little Indian boy whose name was Hiawatha. More than anything else, Hiawatha wanted to become a great hunter.
Mighty brave and mighty strong was the little Indian hunter, little Hiawatha, bravest of the braves. Now he came from distant land in a white birch bark canoe, with his little bow and arrow in his hand.
Down the stream and through the canyon, down the rushing Taquamina, sailing through its bends and windings, sailing through its deeps and shadows, came little Hiawatha. For he'd come to hunt the red deer, hunt the rabbit, the wabasso, hunt the squirrel, the agidwamo, hunt the great bear, Mishimoqua. Fearless was this mighty warrior, skilled in all the crafts of hunters. Sure of foot was Hiawatha.
In the forest he did find animals of every kind. There were squirrels
and birds
and beavers, rabbits too.
What a cinch, thought Hiawatha, hunting animals is no trick.
With so many
I can easily take my pick.
Eagerly, Hiawatha looked at the animals around him. There were squirrels and birds and beavers and rabbits and a porcupine and a badger and 2 weasels. Hiawatha aimed his arrow at the little rabbit, but before he could shoot, the laughing animals had scampered away and were safe in their holes, and the birds were jeering at him from their treetop nests. Hiawatha was turning to go when he saw strange tracks on the ground. Quickly, he bent down to study them. He was sure he had never seen such tracks before, and his heart beat like a tom-tom. Perhaps I have found a new kind of animal, he thought. Head down, and on his hands and knees, he followed the tracks. Suddenly, a shrill whirring startled him. Looking up, he saw a giant cricket rubbing his wings together. Hiawatha was so scared as he looked in the cricket's great strange eyes that he gave a yelp and, turning, ran as fast as he could. The forest animals popped out of their holes. "Hiawatha's afraid of a cricket!" they cried. Shame-faced Hiawatha stopped running, but the little animals could not stop laughing. "Afraid of a cricket!" a little rabbit choked, drumming his paw on the ground. "Oh, my! Afraid of a cricket!" Hiawatha's face turned as red as the sun painted on the side of his little canoe. No impudent little rabbit was going to make fun of him. Grabbing his bow and arrow, Hiawatha chased the rabbit. The bunny ran and dodged among the great tree trunks, but Hiawatha stayed right behind him and finally cornered him. He aimed his arrow right at the bunny's heart. Trembling, the poor little rabbit sat up and begged for mercy. Hiawatha saw the tears in the bunny's big brown eyes, and in spite of himself, he was touched. "All right," he said crossly. "Shoo! Scat! You won't get off so easily again!" The rabbit ran off, and immediately Hiawatha was surrounded by joyful, grateful animals. Seeing how friendly they were, Hiawatha made a resolution. He swore never to hunt his animal friends again. Just to make sure, he took his bow and 1 arrow and smashed them across his knee. Since Hiawatha no longer wanted to become a mighty hunter, he decided to become an explorer. He started off to explore the island and soon found great paw marks on the ground. Creeping forward quietly, Hiawatha followed the mysterious paw marks. Suddenly, there he was, face to face with a bear cub hidden behind a rock. The cub squealed with fear and dashed off as fast as his shaggy little legs could carry him. Hiawatha ran after him. He did not understand why the cub should be so frightened. "Stay and play with me," he shouted. "Stay and play with me." But the cub would not listen to Hiawatha. He headed for his cave with Hiawatha close behind. In the dark of the cave, suddenly Hiawatha made a pounce. He felt something shaggy. "Got you," he laughed, and wrapped his arms tightly around the squirming cub. But then a terrible roar shook the forest. This was no cub. This was the mother bear he had caught. You can be sure little Hiawatha let go, fast, and now it was his turn to be chased. He fled helter-skelter, with the roaring bear just behind him. Fortunately, Hiawatha's new-found forest friends saw his danger. The beavers pounded out an SOS with their tails, and the alarm was heard all over the island. First to answer were the weasels. "Quick, this way," they urged Hiawatha. He fled past them, and behind him they spread out a trap of vines for the furious mother bear. Then the friendly beavers took over. At the river bank, Hiawatha dashed out on a tree trunk, and the beavers ferried him across. The mother bear hesitated a moment at the cold water, but then she, too, plunged in and crossed over. When he had crossed the river, Hiawatha climbed a tree, but the roaring bear climbed right after him. Hiawatha would have been caught, had not the squirrels shown him a way down out of the mother bear's reach. Then the squirrels made a harness of tree limbs and hitched it to a little deer. "Giddy up," they shouted, and Hiawatha was off. By Deer Express, Hiawatha was carried swiftly through the forest. Soon the growls of the bear faded out behind him, and he knew he was safe. When they came to the bank of the river, Hiawatha climbed into his little white canoe with the red sun painted on the side. "Goodbye," he called to his new forest friends. "I'll be back soon." A happy Hiawatha turned the bow of his canoe homeward. He had not learned to become a great hunter, but he knew that he had made many new friends.
Mighty brave and mighty strong was the little Indian hunter.
Little Hiawatha, bravest of the brave.
This is the story of Elmer Elephant and its very long nose. You see, there is nothing much longer than an elephant's nose, or trunk, and although Elmer was just a little elephant, his trunk was so long that it nearly reached the ground, and he could pick up peanuts with it.
Elmer the elephant, cute baby elephant, had a very long nose. Although it was longer, you'll see it was stronger than any other animal's nose.
The day our story begins, Elmer was invited to a birthday party. It was Tilly Tiger's birthday, and Elmer decided to give her a bouquet of flowers as a present. So he picked a beautiful bunch of posies with his trunk and skipped and danced through the forest on his way to Tilly's house. Tilly's house was in a tree, but the birthday party was in the yard below. When Tilly saw Elmer come in the gate, she called, "Hurry, Elmer, you're just in time. I'm going to blow out the candles on my cake." Elmer ran forward and stood at one end of the table. It was the end nearest Tilly. It was also the end nearest the cake. "Now watch me," cried Tilly, and she drew in a great breath of air. Then she blew very, very hard, but the candles merely flickered as if they were winking at her. Again she tried. This time she filled her cheeks with so much air she looked like a fat squirrel with a mouthful of nuts. But again the candles only winked, as if they were laughing to themselves. Elmer Elephant was sure he could blow them all out, and he hoped Tilly would ask him. But instead she called to Joey Hippopotamus, who was standing at the other end of the table. "You do it, Joey," she said. "You're so much stronger than I am." "Well, of course, if you insist," said Joey proudly. Looking very important, Joey threw back his head and drew in a tremendous breath of air, and then he blew. In fact, he blew so hard that the birthday cake flew up in the air, and came down squash, right on top of Elmer's trunk. There was a sudden hush. Then you should have heard the shrieks of laughter. All the children clapped their hands and shouted, "Look at Elmer's cakey trunk! Look at Elmer's trunky cake!" Tilly ran forward and told him not to mind. She'd have him fixed up in no time. And she did, too, for she wiped off every last bit of the cake and frosting. Not until then did Elmer remember the flowers he had brought, so he handed them to Tilly, and she was so pleased she gave him a big kiss. "Just a minute," she said. "I'll go up into my house and get some more cake for the party." While she was gone, all the other boys at the party gathered around Elmer and began to tease him. One boy put a long stem on his nose. Another had a stocking hanging from his nose. Another one picked up a garden hose and hung it on his nose. And they all waddled around with a slow, swinging walk, just like Elmer's. Then one of the boys caught Elmer's trunk and stretched it away out and let it go with a snap. Then they all started to fight him and backed him clear out of Tilly's yard and away from the party. Then they leaned over the fence and yelled at him.
No matter how he tried, Elmer could never hide such a very long nose. Because others joked at him, pointed and poked at him, Elmer ran away.
Feeling very sorry for himself, Elmer walked through the forest until he came to his favorite pool. He thought the cold water would soothe his aching trunk and make him feel better. When he saw his reflection in the water, he suddenly realized that his trunk was by far the longest nose in the forest. The longer Elmer looked, the longer his nose seemed to be. He must get rid of it somehow. He tried to tuck it in his blouse, but as soon as he looked up, it popped out again. He tried to roll it up like a ribbon, but it came right unrolled. He even tied a knot in it, but that made it look worse than ever. Elmer started to cry. Big elephant tears rolled down his cheeks. He knew it was no use. He had that awful nose, and he had to keep it. Suddenly he heard a voice that seemed to come from high in the air. Looking up quickly, Elmer saw his good friend Caleb the giraffe. "What's the matter, son?" asked old Caleb. "Having nose trouble?" Elmer blinked the tears away and nodded his head. "Well, best thing to do is blow it. Use your handkerchief." "Feel better now? Don't you worry about your long nose. People used to laugh at my long neck, too, but they soon stopped when they saw me eating the tender top leaves of the trees that they couldn't reach themselves. And what's more, long noses are sometimes just as useful as long necks."
Elmer found a friend very old and very wise who said to him,
"You're lucky, son.
You can use your nose in many, many ways, as a rope or as a fire hose."
All at once, old Caleb stopped speaking and began to sniff the air excitedly. "I smell smoke," he said. Then, rearing up his long neck, he looked all around. His neck was as tall as a tower, so he could see a long, long distance. And what he saw made him tremble with fear. "It's Tilly's house!" he shouted. "Tilly Tiger's house is on fire!" Elmer forgot his nose. He forgot the boys who had made fun of him. He forgot everything except that Tilly was in danger, and he must do something to save her. "Water! Water! Fill your nose with water!" yelled Caleb. So Elmer stuck his trunk into the pond and sucked up as much water as his long nose could hold. Then he jumped on Caleb's back, and the tall giraffe ran as fast as his big long legs could go, right over to Tilly's treehouse. Elmer shinnied up Caleb's long neck and found he was level with Tilly's burning house. With a great effort, he squirted his trunk full of water at the fire, and it was just enough to put the fire out. Tilly stepped over to Elmer's arms and was safe. When Caleb set them both down on the ground, Tilly took Elmer's trunk and lifted it up and put it around her, and then gave Elmer a proper kiss, a great big one. Elmer's face got as red as a beet, but he was very happy. So after that, Elmer Elephant never worried about his long trunk again, and no one ever made fun of it either.
Now Elmer the elephant's proud of his elegant, fine, magnificent nose. No more does he hide it.
Indeed, he's delighted
To be an elephant. 'Cause all of the others, if they had their brother's wish, they were elephants too.
Hello, this is your Disneyland storyteller, and I'm going to tell you the story of the Flying Mouse. Once upon a time, far out in the corner of a sunny field, lived a large family of mice. There was Daddy Field Mouse and Mommy Field Mouse, and 7 little field mice. The youngest and the smallest of the family was named Freddie. Although the rest of his family was happy, Freddie was not. He was a very unhappy field mouse. All day long, while his brothers and sisters played Mouse Gets the Cheese, Hide and Squeak, and other games, Freddie just sat under a toadstool and watched the birds, and he wished and wished that he could fly. He pictured himself zooming and dipping through the bright blue sky and flying so well that even the birds admired his style. One fine day, Freddie decided that he must try to fly. So he found 2 big leaves and tied one onto each of his arms. Then he ran as fast as he could up a little hill beside the meadow pool. He flapped his leaves, and the wind rushed past his perspiring face, and all of a sudden he took off and fell kerplunk right into the meadow pool. You should have heard how his brothers and sisters laughed at him. But Freddie was not discouraged. The next day he tried again. This time he bent a tall sunflower stalk farther and farther down until the flower almost touched the ground. Then he let go and zing! For a moment he flew, but then he landed kersplash in his mother's washtub. Mommy Field Mouse was very cross with Freddie and sent him in to change his very wet clothes. When he came out again, he went over to his favorite toadstool and sat down. He was very unhappy, and 2 large tears formed in his big brown eyes. Just then, he heard a very faint cry of help. He looked around him and saw a lovely butterfly caught in a big spider's web. He rushed to help her and get her untangled just in time as the big spider was coming home to his web. Suddenly, right before his eyes, the butterfly turned into a beautiful fairy with a magic wand in her hand.
Freddie Field Mouse, she said, for being so brave and kind, I can grant you one wish.
I want to fly. Please give me wings, Freddie said. And sure enough, before he could say another word, he found he had a beautiful pair of brown wings that just matched the rest of him.
Thank you, Fairy,
Freddie said, but she had disappeared. This was the big moment that Freddie had been waiting for all his life. He gave his new wings 2 or 3 practice flaps, then took a little running start and soared up into the blue. It was wonderful, just as he'd always thought it would be. He zoomed and dipped and turned, and then he soared straight for the treetops to visit the birds as he'd always dreamed of doing. But when he landed on a limb, all of the birds were frightened and flew away. That is, all but Oliver Owl, who was perched on a higher-up branch. Freddie didn't even see him, and when Oliver suddenly said, "Who are you?" it frightened Freddie so much he fell off the limb and hit the ground before he remembered his wings and began to flap them furiously. So he recovered just in the nick of time and flew back up to the branch that Oliver Owl was sitting on.
You frightened me, Freddie said.
I asked you a question. You didn't answer it. Who are you?
I'm Freddie Field Mouse.
What's a field mouse doing in a tree?
I flew here with my new wings, Freddie said proudly.
It's unnatural. It won't work. and you'll be very unhappy.
You're nothing but a nothing, a nothing, a nothing. You're nothing but a nothing. You're not a thing at all. To be a bat's a bum thing, a silly and dumb thing. At least a bat is something. You're not a thing at all. Though life may seem a glum thing, a silly and dumb thing, it's better to be something than not a thing at all.
With that, Oliver swiveled his head around in a complete circle and then suddenly flew away, leaving Freddie all alone. It was very lonesome in the treetops without any birds around, and the wind began to blow, and it grew very cold. Freddie began to wish for a snug, warm home. I'll fly home, he thought, and he did just that. His brothers and sisters were playing in the yard. I'll surprise them, Freddie thought, and he buzzed right over their heads. They were all so frightened they ran into the house and locked the door. Freddie called and called, but they wouldn't let him in. The sun went down, and the big cold moon came up, and it got very dark, and Freddie was scared and couldn't imagine where he could spend the night. He walked and he walked through the tall, dark weeds. Finally, he came to a big cave in the side of a hill. He tiptoed in and found himself staring into hundreds of evil yellow eyes. It was a cave full of bats, and as Freddie looked at them, they suddenly all took flight and flew out of the cave with a rush of ugly wings. Freddie began to cry. The old owl had been right. A field mouse with wings just didn't seem to belong anywhere.
Oh, how I wish I were just a mouse once more,
he sobbed. Suddenly, the cave was filled with light, and the fairy stood before him again.
Freddie,
she said kindly,
you have learned a good lesson. To use what you have as well as you are able, and to be content with your lot. Your wish is granted.
The hateful wings disappeared, and as Freddie spoke his thanks to the fairy, she disappeared too. So Freddie ran home just as fast as his little legs could carry him. Daddy Field Mouse, Mommy Field Mouse, and his 6 little brothers and sisters were ever so glad to see him. And Freddie was very glad to be home too, and he never wished for wings again. He was happy to be just himself.
That's the sound of the ugly duckling. He goes honk, honk as he flies by. That's how he says hello and goodbye. His happy honk tells everyone when he grows up he'll grow into a swan.
Hello, this is your Disneyland storyteller with the story of the Ugly Duckling. One lovely summer afternoon, a mother duck sat quietly on her nest. In the nest, warm and snug, were 5 beautiful eggs. The mother duck sat very still, with her wings spread out to protect the nest from the wind, for she was waiting for the eggs to hatch into little ducklings. The father duck was waiting also, but he was not so patient as the mother. He marched up and down beside the nest, stopping every now and then to ask the mother why it took so long for eggs to hatch. At last the mother duck gave a quack of joy and sprang off the nest. The eggs were rocking back and forth. From inside them came tiny sounds of pecking and scratching. The mother duck and the father duck bent over the nest anxiously and waited for the eggs to hatch. One after another, 4 of the eggs cracked open, and out tumbled 4 tiny yellow ducklings with bright little eyes and cute little bills. They stood up on their wobbly little legs and looked around them. Quacking happily, they clambered out of the nest and waddled around in the great big new world. But the mother and the father duck kept on looking into the nest, for the biggest of the 5 eggs had not yet hatched. Soon the big egg showed signs of life. In a moment, 2 little feet broke through the shell. Then a head appeared, but it was a big, white, and fuzzy head, instead of small and yellow and downy like the other ducklings. The newest member of the family wriggled out of the shell and opened his mouth and said, "Honk, honk, honk, honk," very loud.
"That certainly is a funny-looking duckling," the father duck exclaimed. "Why isn't he little and yellow and round like the others? And why does he say honk, honk instead of quack, quack?"
And he waddled away with his bill in the air. The 4 little yellow brothers and sisters gathered around the big white one and looked at him curiously.
Why, he's not like us,
They quacked.
Why, we won't play with him. He's ugly.
And with their mother, they turned their backs on the big white one and waddled away down toward the pond. The poor ugly duckling couldn't understand why everyone had gone away and left him alone. He wanted to play too, so he followed the mother duck down to the pond. She was swimming around with the 4 little ducklings riding on her back. The ugly duckling wanted to join them, so he honked. But his mother scolded him and told him to go away. She looked so angry the ugly duckling was frightened, so he went and sat all alone at the edge of the pond. The ugly duckling looked after them wistfully.
"Why won't they play with me?"
he wondered sadly.
"And why do they call me ugly?"
Big tears filled his eyes, and try as he might to stop them, they splashed on the ground and trickled into the water at his feet. Just then he happened to look down and see his reflection in the water. A strange, ugly face leered back at him. This was just because the surface of the pond was ruffled by the wind, but the ugly duckling didn't understand that.
"No wonder they won't play with me,"
he thought sadly.
"If that's the way I look, I'll go hide where no one can see how ugly I am."
And so he turned away and went slowly toward the dark and gloomy forest. As he went along deeper and deeper into the woods, the branches of the trees shut out the sunlight. The shadows deepened, and the heavy stillness frightened him. Suddenly, through the silent gloom, he heard the cheery, friendly chirping of some baby marsh birds.
"They sound happy," he thought. "Maybe they will let me play with them."
He found the marsh bird's nest in the branch of a low tree and hopped up into it. The nest was soft and warm, and the ugly duckling felt quite at home with the baby birds. He tried to join them in a song, but all he could do was honk, honk, honk.
"You're way off key,"
they laughed.
"Why doesn't your mother give you singing lessons?" "My mother doesn't like me,"
said the ugly duckling.
"Don't worry," the little birds said. "Our mother will like you."
When the little marsh bird's mother flew back to her babies, she carried an enormous worm in her beak. But alas, before she could feed any of them, the ugly duckling reached up and caught it in his mouth. The mother bird was furious. She pulled the worm away from him.
Get out, you great big ugly thing,"
she screeched, and flew at the frightened duckling in a rage. She chased him out of the nest and out of the tree. Away through the forest he ran, as fast as his legs could carry him. Back to the safety of the pond he streaked and dived into the water. He was swimming away as fast as he could go, when suddenly, bang! He bumped his head. He looked up and saw a duck with a lovely red head and beautiful blue and green wings. It rocked back and forth gently on the water, and it seemed to smile at him. The ugly duckling couldn't believe his eyes. He dived under a water lily pad and peeked out cautiously. This time there was no mistake. The duck was smiling at him. Poor little ugly duckling. How could he know that this was only a painted wooden duck, a decoy set out in the water by hunters to attract live ducks? He thought the decoy was real and bravely paddled up to it.
At last, the ugly duckling thought, I've found a friend.
He took heart and climbed on the decoy's back and used its bill as a diving board.
Having a friend is fun,
He thought as he sailed through the air in a real high dive. Splash! He hit the water. His dive carried him almost to the bottom of the pond, but he bobbed quickly to the surface. Just as he came out, whack! The rocking decoy's heavy wooden bill hit him on the head. Down into the murky water of the pond he sank. Weakly he struggled for the shore and dragged himself up among the sheltering reeds. Tears came to his eyes again.
Everyone in the world hates me because I'm so ugly,
he sobbed. And he crept out on a floating log and drifted along in the sun. The pain in his head and the pain in his heart were almost too much for him to bear. So he lay down and cried and cried and cried.
Honk, 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 honk.
The ugly duckling rubbed away his tears. There, right in front of him, paddling in the water, were 4 little fuzzy white creatures. They looked just like him.
What's the matter? Crying on a beautiful sunny day like this?
They all asked at once.
Come on in and play with us.
The ugly duckling dried his tears and dived off the log. They all played tag together and had water races. Just as the ugly duckling was having more fun than he'd ever had in his whole life before, he looked up and saw the most beautiful white bird in the world.
Mother, Mother,
his new friends cried.
We found a little brother, and he's going to play with us now and forever.
Of course he is, said the beautiful swan in a gentle voice, and she folded the ugly duckling in her soft white wings and told him the truth about himself. You're not a duckling at all, she explained. You're a little swan, and someday you will be king of the pond. On the shore, the mother duck and her brood were amazed to see what had happened to the ugly duckling.
Come back and play with us,
they called. But the ugly duckling found where he really belonged and sailed majestically away with the swans.
He goes honk honk as he flies by. That's how he says hello and goodbye. His happy honk tells everyone when he grows up he'll grow into a swan. When he was born, he didn't look like much except in maybe a duck. But all the other baby ducks didn't like his looks 'cause he wasn't a duck. They said he was an ugly duckling, that's what he was. But what they didn't know was that when he grew up, he'd grow into a swan. Yes, he'll grow into a beautiful swan.